Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on causal relationships. We're going to start off with the definition, which we usually do when we're learning a new concept, and here it is. So, some independent variable, which we abbreviate as IV or X, is a factor whose change leads to changes in a dependent variable, which we abbreviate as dV or Y. If you need a little refresher on what X and Y are, what the dV and IV are, no worries. There's a video on that you can go ahead and review and come back. So basically, in terms of the definition, we're saying that the independent variable, how a person is on that independent variable, is causing them to be a certain way with regard to the dependent variable. And I'm going to use people, in my examples because it's just easier to when we're learning these concepts. Okay, so in terms of annotation, it's going to look something like this. For us today, X, which is the independent variable, is leading to or causing Y. Okay, so our question has to do with that arrow in terms of wanting to know if this is a causal relationship. Is X causing Y, or is there just a relationship between these two? Okay, so let's start off with sort of an easy example. Okay, an everyday sort of example, right? We see, let's say we're a witness to this. So if someone asked us the question, what caused this fall, then we can point to the rocks and say the rocks are the ones that led to the fall, right? If the rock hadn't been there, probably this person would not fall, right? So in our case, in this example, X is the rock, the independent variable is the rock, and Y is the fall. So in other words, had the rock not been there, the fall would not have happened, right? The independent variable of a rock, whether it's there or not, right? That's what we mean by changes in it. Like whether it's there or it's not there is what determines whether the person falls or doesn't fall. So let's give another sort of example, which is looking at witnessing domestic violence and whether or not that causes perpetrating violence as an adult. So this is the example that we're going to use for the rest of the presentation. So in our case here, witnessing is the X, or the independent variable, and perpetrating violence as an adult is the dependent variable. One thing to note is that causation is not the same as correlation. When we use the word correlation, we're basically meaning that there's a relationship between these two variables. So this is what it might look like. So we have witnessing domestic violence as a child as the independent variable, and just remember the IV always goes on the x-axis. That's why it's abbreviated as X. Which is the horizontal axis. And here we're just going to have a yes or a no. Pretend this is a survey, a made-up survey. We're asking people, did you witness? And they say no or yes. And then for our dependent variable of perpetrating violence, we're just going to do a simple scale, number of acts, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10 or more. And remember that the dependent variable always goes on the vertical axis, which is Y, and that's why it's called the Y-axis. In any case, let's pretend that we've collected some data and we want to know, okay, let's look at the group of folks who said no. What was the average number of acts that they ended up perpetrating, violent acts, right? So on average, it was about a 2. Now remember, averages mean that some people will say 0, some people might say 20 or more, but it averaged for this group of people who did not witness domestic violence to be a 2. For those who did, they perpetrated on average more acts of violence. So if we just look at these data, we can say, right, we draw our little line, that there seems to be a positive relationship. If you witness domestic violence, you are more likely to perpetrate violence, right? Remember, I'm making this up, although this is likely true. In any case, this is evidence of a relationship. What this doesn't tell us is whether witnessing domestic violence as a child is what led to or caused the violence as an adult. In order to go beyond just looking at this as a relationship and establish causality, there are 3 criteria we must establish. The first criteria we need to establish causality is what we just went over in the previous slide, which is that there's this relationship, this correlation between the independent variable and the dependent variable. That's sort of like the first step. And then number 2, the independent variable must occur first in time before the dependent variable. And finally, number 3, the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable must not be spurious. Okay? And that means that basically it disappears when we account for other variables. So those are the 3 criteria. Let's go through and elaborate. Okay, number 1. This relationship exists, right? So we've already gone over this in the graphing lecture, which is also a video here, in terms of the different types of relationship, right? You can have no relationship, but then there's the 3 types of relationships you can have. Positive, which is like the one here, negative, where the slope goes down, and then curvilinear. Right? So in any case, regardless of the type, we're looking for there being a relationship so that it's not a flat line. Once we've established that, we have to look at making sure that the independent variable occurs first in time before the dv. Okay, so it comes first. So if we have time, which for now, we see linearly. I think I made the same joke in the variables video. But in any case, time is moving forward, right? And if this is the past, and this is the present, and this is the future, and we're going with the example of witnessing domestic violence, well, the domestic violence had to have happened in the past as a child for us to then look at whether it caused the perpetrating violence as an adult, right? It had to come first. If it's anything that causes something to happen, it happens first. So when we're with this particular example, it sort of makes logical sense. So I'm going to give you another example where time and what came first may be in question. So let's say I want to know, does depression, the independent variable, cause substance abuse? Well, in terms of time, we would have to establish that the depression came first, a person was depressed, and then they started using substances or abusing substances, right? But if we look at these 2 variables differently, we can see that for some people, they start using substances first, and then that leads to depression for them. So here in this example, I have to show that the person was depressed first, not that they used substances first and then became depressed. It's that they were depressed first and then used substances, okay? So the third criteria was the tricky one, which is the relationship between the independent and dependent variable must not be spurious, which means that when we account for other variables, the relationship disappears. So how do we establish that? Well, let's go back to our example of having the independent variable be domestic violence, right? We were trying to establish that witnessing domestic violence as a child, which comes first, leads to or causes that child to grow up and be more likely to perpetuate violence as an adult or perpetrate keep getting those two confused, but both work. Okay, now let's say when we're collecting all of the information from people, we ask about parental substance abuse. And when I say parental substance abuse, I mean the child's parent. So if that child who witnessed domestic violence, if as an adult they tell us, yes, my father abused substances. And then we look at the data and we see that there's a relationship between parental substance abuse and witnessing domestic violence, and parental substance abuse and perpetrating violence. Is that right? Perpetrating. Then that means that even though we thought that there was a causal relationship here between witnessing domestic violence and perpetrating violence as an adult, actually we were wrong. There is no causal relationship, that it's the parental substance abuse that is somehow affecting both of them. So let me give you another example. Whoops, yeah, circle. There, that's the one. Okay, so let's say we're studying third graders and we want to know, is attention, being attentive in class, does that cause children to get better grades in that class, right? Okay, seems like a simple sort of, does paying attention lead to better grades? Does it cause kids to have better grades? So we can go through, we can show that there's a relationship. We can show that the attention came first and then the grades came last, right? Or came after. But what if we consider having enough nutrition? Now, let's say we take this into account and it turns out that if a child in third grade has enough nutrition, that leads them to be more attentive in class. They have more attention in class. And having enough nutrition leads to better grades. So in other words, it's not that being attentive in this third grade class is what's leading to the better grades. It's that having enough nutrition is leading to both of them. So if this happens, then that means there's no causal relationship between attention and grades. Okay, so we would have to show that this is not the case, that having enough nutrition is not what leads to both of these. And if we can do that, if we can show that the relationship is not spurious, then we have a causal relationship. But showing all three of these criteria is very difficult, which is why we often in research don't use the word cause. We'll say there's a lot of evidence for this relationship, and other similar phrasing. Okay, so that's it for causal relationships. Thank you and have a wonderful day.